A human engineer had come for a simple task, nothing more. But in an instant, an alien queen shattered his ordinary life with a single declaration. "No, you are to be my husband." What followed was a story of interstellar intrigue, unexpected laughter, and a love that no one could have predicted. The hum of the palace's artificial atmosphere was subtle, almost musical, a low vibration beneath the footsteps of the engineer as he hesitated at the threshold. The corridors shimmered with light, walls of crystalline panels reflecting his own reflection in fractal patterns that made him feel both larger and smaller at once. He adjusted the strap of his utility bag nervously, aware that every small movement echoed unnaturally in the vast hall. "Just an engineer," he muttered under his breath, a mantra intended to ground him, though it did little to calm the sudden hammering of his heart. The palace had been described to him in reports, of course, luxurious, sprawling, impossible, but nothing in those dry words prepared him for the living, breathing spectacle of it. Light danced across surfaces that seemed to respond to thought, corridors that subtly rearranged themselves to accommodate the flow of visitors, and holographic guides that winked and gestured at him with what felt like genuine curiosity. He paused at the entrance to the throne room, peering in and immediately regretting doing so. The chamber was enormous, high enough that the ceiling disappeared into soft clouds of glowing gas. The floor itself was smooth, polished, and slightly luminescent, bouncing back his clumsy shoes in a way that reminded him he was not on Earth. Servants and nobles moved with measured grace, their skin tones varying from pale lavender to muted silver, and one or two entirely unfamiliar hues that made him blink. They wore fabrics that seemed to float around them, garments that whispered against the floor without touching it. And there, in the center of it all, seated upon a throne that seemed grown from a single crystalline structure, was the queen. She was magnificent in a way that made words stumble. Her skin was a rich, verdant green, luminous under the shifting lights, and her long golden hair fell in soft waves that caught the glow of the room as if it were made to reflect starlight. Her ears, elongated and delicate, extended gracefully upward, framing her face in a way both alien and familiar. The crown she wore was minimal, almost ceremonial in its restraint, but it seemed to float slightly above her hair as if held by some invisible magnetic field. She regarded him steadily, eyes like twin topaz orbs that glittered with intelligence, and something he couldn't yet name, amusement, perhaps, or curiosity, or a spark of mischief. I'm just an engineer," he managed, the words coming out more like a squeak than a declaration, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile balance of the room. He expected her to nod politely, to wave him toward some seat far from importance, and perhaps dismiss him quietly from her memory in a few hours. Instead, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, and the sound of her voice, soft, musical, and oddly grounding, cut through the silence. "No," she said, not with anger but with a firmness that silenced even the murmurs of the court. "You are to be my husband." Time staggered. Somewhere a crystal bowl rang as though struck by an invisible mallet. An aide dropped a tablet that hovered in midair before clattering to the floor. The engineer's jaw opened and closed like a faulty servo mechanism, and a faint wheeze of panic escaped him. I think there's been some mistake," he said, attempting to inject rationality into the moment, though every instinct screamed that he was already well past the point of error. The queen leaned slightly forward, her elongated ears tilting in a way that suggested both patience and a faint amusement. "No mistake. You are not merely visiting. You are essential." Her emphasis on the last word had an odd cadence, almost like it carried a weight beyond explanation, a meaning that rolled through the chamber and made the gathered nobles exchange confused glances. Whispers began, subdued but persistent. "The human," the engineer. One elder diplomat tried to clear his throat and gesticulate in a language that the engineer didn't understand. Another noble elbowed him lightly, their expression somewhere between shock and glee, as if the entire announcement were a spectacular theatrical performance. Trying to recover his balance, the engineer gestured vaguely to the throne and himself. I build engines, not empires," he stammered. "I repair things. I don't marry queens." He winced, realizing that sounded both pathetic and absurdly presumptuous in the same breath. The Queen's laughter was soft, lilting, and entirely disarming. It resonated through the chamber like the ringing of fine glass. "Perhaps not yet," she said, her tone teasing. "But we shall see how essential you truly are." Her eyes twinkled, and for the first time, the engineer detected a playfulness that cut through the shock. It was as if she were inviting him into a game whose rules he had yet to understand. At that moment, a minor mishap broke the tension entirely. The engineer shifted nervously, stepping back on a panel that activated a small anti-gravity lift beneath him. He yelped as his feet left the floor, flailing briefly before the device word and gently lowered him back down. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, some polite, some openly delighted at his clumsiness. Even the Queen chuckled softly, the sound harmonizing with the hum of the palace. The engineer's face turned bright red, not from embarrassment alone, but from the absurdity of floating helplessly in front of an entire alien court. As he tried to regain composure, the palace technology seemed to notice his agitation. Small orbs hovered near him, projecting visual cues that pointed out handholds, steps, and etiquette suggestions. One even projected a tiny animated version of himself, bowing clumsily to the Queen. He could not help but snort with laughter, realizing that the court's high-tech systems had a sense of humor as well. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "I'm famous, floating, and ridiculous all at once." The Queen watched him with that same knowing amusement. "Do not fear, engineer," she said, voice warm and commanding. "You will learn, and I will guide you." Her words carried both reassurance and an undeniable authority. For courage is not knowing all the rules, it is stepping forward when the outcome is uncertain. The engineer nodded, though inside his mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. How did a simple engineer end up in a scenario straight out of an interstellar romance tale? What did it mean to be essential to a queen he barely knew? And perhaps most importantly, could he survive the next few hours without committing another etiquette disaster? Humor became his shield. When a hovering tray of ceremonial refreshments glided too close, he ducked instinctively, sending a small orb of glowing liquid into an elegant swirl that narrowly missed a diplomat's robes. Engineering hazard," he offered weakly, earning a mixture of laughter and exasperated groans. Even the Queen's smile widened slightly. The moment was absurd, but absurdity had a way of breaking tension, and the engineer felt a small spark of relief. Perhaps he could navigate this world, one misstep at a time, and maybe even find a way to exist as both human and partner to a being so magnificently alien. As the chamber quieted, the engineer allowed himself a moment to observe the Queen more closely. Her green skin shimmered under the ambient light, her hair caught tiny glimmers that shifted like sunlight through leaves, and her elongated ears moved subtly, tracking him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. She was regal, commanding, yet approachable in a way that unsettled and fascinated him simultaneously. He realized with a jolt that this was no ordinary royal decree. It was an invitation, an opening into a life he could never have imagined, full of challenges, wonder, and perhaps even laughter shared with a queen whose world was both beautiful and bewildering. By the time he was led to a side chamber for a preliminary orientation, an alien room filled with floating devices, self-adjusting furniture, and softly glowing screens, he had begun to accept, albeit hesitantly, that he would need to embrace this new life. His mantra changed subtly. "Not just an engineer may be essential," he muttered, half to himself and half to the hovering guidance orbs. A small chuckle escaped him, surprising even himself, as he realized that perhaps the universe had a sense of humor, and he, for better or worse, was right in the center of it. Outside, the palace hummed with activity. Courtiers whispered, servants floated delicately to and fro, and distant stars cast multicolored reflections that danced like fireflies on the crystalline walls. Inside, a human engineer, clumsy, awkward, and wholly unprepared, stood at the threshold of destiny, his heart racing, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips despite the chaos. The Queen's words echoed in his mind, mingling with laughter and disbelief. "You are to be my husband." He shook his head, still smiling. Somehow, somewhere, he had gone from just an engineer to central character in a story that promised adventure, challenge, and the most unexpected companionship imaginable. And somehow, he thought with a mixture of dread and excitement, he was going to survive it, or at least stumble through it with style. The palace was vast, the rules were alien, and the engineer was painfully human. But in that moment, surrounded by light, laughter, and luminous green skin, he knew that nothing would ever be ordinary again. The morning light in the palace didn't fall as it would on Earth. Instead, it shimmered through the crystalline walls in shifting prisms of color, painting the corridors in a living rainbow. The engineer rubbed his eyes, still unaccustomed to the gentle glow that seemed to anticipate his waking, almost like the palace itself had a sense of humor. He sat up on a mattress that hovered several inches above the floor, adjusting to its subtle, unyielding softness. It was comfortable in a way that was both luxurious and unnerving, too smart for him to ignore, as if it was judging his posture, his sleep, even his potential for clumsiness. He muttered, "Just an engineer. Definitely not royalty," and swung his legs over the side. The moment his feet touched the floor, they slipped slightly on the smooth surface, and a small panel beneath him responded by projecting a holographic hand to steady him. "Good morning, sir," said the holographic interface, its voice politely amused. "Might I suggest a slight adjustment in gait to reduce friction-induced slips?" The engineer blinked. Thank you." He gave a short, awkward bow to an interface that didn't really need it. "I think I'll manage." By the time he reached the breakfast chamber, he realized that managing was going to be a full-time job. Anti-gravity trays hovered beside every chair, each containing delicacies that defied both gravity and logic. Transparent liquids floated in spheres, emitting soft glows, and pastries hovered in slow arcs, guided by unseen currents. He reached for a loaf of bread, only for it to swerve out of reach and float toward a gathering of diplomats, who stared at him with raised eyebrows as the orb spun gently above their heads. He caught it after a panicked lunge and set it down, muttering under his breath, "I'm clearly not ready for this level of sophistication." The queen arrived shortly after, her long golden hair gleaming, her green skin reflecting the prismatic light in a way that made her appear almost ethereal. She didn't just enter, she glided, moving with a rhythm that seemed to bend the very air around her. She raised a delicate hand, and one of the floating pastries obediently landed on her plate. The engineer felt a pang of envy, not for the food, but for the effortless grace with which she navigated a world that seemed determined to make him look like a bumbling amateur. "Good morning," she said, her voice both commanding and playful. "Sleep well?" He nodded, though it was unclear whether he was answering the question or confessing the truth. "Yes, I think," he admitted. "Though the mattress, it judged me." He gestured vaguely, earning a soft laugh from the queen, a sound that made the colors of the room shimmer just a little brighter. "You will find," she said, "that judgment is a constant companion here. It is not malicious, only observant." She took a sip from a floating cup, her eyes catching his with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Tell me, engineer, how do you find interstellar etiquette?" He swallowed. "Extremely complicated." He paused, considering whether honesty or flattery would serve him better. "Also terrifying, and slightly, terrifyingly complicated." He stumbled over his words, feeling the absurdity of trying to summarize human reactions in a court designed to challenge physics itself. The queen's laughter, soft and musical, filled the chamber. "Fear not," she said. "Even we make mistakes. Observe." She gestured subtly, and a small holographic display projected the image of a royal advisor, slipping on a floating staircase and landing on a cushioned platform designed for safety. But still, the pose was comically dramatic. Even those trained for centuries can stumble. Humor became a lifeline. Throughout the day, the engineer discovered that palace life demanded a peculiar mixture of observation, improvisation, and occasional luck. He learned to navigate corridors that sometimes shifted their geometry without warning, guided not by maps, but by subtle cues from glowing panels and the occasional nudging of levitating furniture. One corridor led him into a meeting, where a group of interstellar traders from a distant nebula argued passionately over the appropriate way to serve a sentient fruit. He entered at precisely the wrong moment, tripping over a foot-high barrier of glowing mist and colliding softly into a table, sending both fruit and traders into minor disarray. The queen, observing from a balcony, smothered a laugh with one gloved hand, and he found himself blushing beneath his human skin, though she could see little evidence of it on her green-hued scales of perception. As the day progressed, he began to notice the subtle ways the queen guided him, often through teasing, sometimes through observation, and occasionally through deliberate challenges. When he struggled with a ceremonial greeting, hands positioned incorrectly according to alien custom, she corrected him not with a command, but by mimicking his error with exaggerated precision, eliciting laughter from both the court and him. "A subtle reminder," she said later, "that mastery begins with humility." By midday, the engineer had developed a sense of rhythm in the chaos, albeit a fragile one. He discovered the palace kitchens were full of machines that prepared meals with astonishing speed and accuracy, though occasionally they had a sense of humor. One dish of protein spheres, meant to orbit a central flavor core, instead spun out of control, ricocheting gently across the room before landing neatly back on its plate. The engineer couldn't resist a snort of laughter, earning a curious glance from the queen. "Impressive, isn't it?" she asked. "Even precision can be unpredictable, much like humans." The afternoon brought a series of unexpected lessons. He was tasked with assisting in the calibration of a defensive energy barrier for the palace, a device that hummed with latent power and could theoretically vaporize a fleet of ships in moments. Despite his protests that he was just an engineer, he applied his skills with care, double-checking connections, adjusting flux ratios, and quietly muttering to himself. The queen observed his work, occasionally commenting on the elegance of his method, her fingers trailing along a floating console, shifting holographic readouts with a flick of her elongated ear-tipped hand. At one point, the barrier reacted unpredictably, generating a small arc of harmless plasma that sizzled toward him. He yelped, ducking instinctively, and the queen laughed outright, a sound that made the hum of the machinery feel almost cheerful. "Courage," she said between chuckles, "is sometimes just surviving your own mistakes." Later, they shared a quieter moment on a balcony that overlooked the orbital city outside the palace. Lights twinkled like scattered gemstones across the void, ships drifting lazily among colossal docking platforms. The queen leaned on the railing, her golden hair catching the reflected light, her green skin shimmering softly. "You handle this life better than I expected," she said, voice low, teasing yet sincere. "Even with errors." "I am a professional," he said quickly, though it came out as a half-hearted joke. "Errors included." She tilted her head, one elongated ear flicking, and smiled. "Perhaps that is what I admire most, the willingness to try, even knowing failure is likely. Very human." Her words made him pause. Somehow, despite all the absurdity and chaos, there was truth in what she said. Perhaps being human, the awkward, stumbling, unpredictable kind, was exactly what the court needed right now. Evening brought further absurdities. A delegation from a neighboring star system arrived, carrying gifts ranging from self-writing scrolls to small creatures that changed color based on mood. One such creature, curious about the engineer, began to orbit him like a tiny, sentient planet. Every time he moved, it followed, occasionally bumping into his shoulder or tripping him over small, levitating objects. Each collision was met with a mixture of horror and laughter from the audience, and the engineer eventually resorted to talking to it gently. "Easy, easy, I'm not food, I think." The queen observed, smiling, her amusement clear but never cruel. By nightfall, the engineer was exhausted, yet strangely exhilarated. The palace had tested him, humbled him, and amused him in equal measure. He had tripped, floated, spilled, and recovered. He had laughed, been laughed at, and seen the queen's sharp, playful mind at work. He realized that perhaps the court's chaos was not meant to break him. It was meant to teach him, to integrate him into a world that was simultaneously alien and inviting. As he lay back in his hovering bed, he could hear the faint hum of the palace responding to the night cycle, subtle shifts in light and air that made the walls seem alive. A small orb floated near his head, projecting a miniature version of the queen, winking. He couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head. "All right," he murmured, voice soft. "I'm just an engineer, but maybe I can do this." Somewhere in the palace, the queen watched the city lights through her window, her golden hair brushing her shoulders, a satisfied gleam in her topaz-like eyes. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new absurdities, and undoubtedly more laughter. She knew he was far from ready, yet there was something about his mixture of clumsiness, courage, and humor that made her certain of one thing. He was essential, in a way that transcended skill or rank, and perhaps even in a way neither of them yet fully understood. The engineer slept fitfully, dreams mingling with floating lights and spinning pastries, but beneath it all lay a spark of determination. He was no longer merely a visitor in an alien palace. He was a participant in a story that was already rewriting itself around him. And as the stars winked outside his window, he felt, oddly, incomprehensibly, that perhaps, just perhaps, he could survive this extraordinary life without completely destroying it. The morning was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the palace itself held its breath in anticipation. The corridors glimmered in shifting colors, but the engineer, no longer trembling at every reflective panel or every floating orb, walked with a steady, albeit slightly awkward, confidence. He had learned to anticipate the palace's little jokes. The occasional misbehaving anti-gravity tray, the floating bouquets that drifted into his path, the holographic etiquette tutors that seemed to smirk at him in subtle loops. Today, he was not merely surviving. He was beginning to navigate this alien world with an ease that surprised him. The queen met him in a central chamber, her long golden hair catching the morning light streaming through crystalline panels, her green skin glowing faintly in the ambient spectrum. She did not sit on her throne. Instead, she floated lightly across the room, moving with a grace that made every step a statement. Her ears, elongated and expressive, tilted subtly as she observed him, and he noted, not for the first time, the mixture of mischief, authority, and warmth that made her impossible to categorize. "Good morning," she said, a note of playful challenge in her voice. "Ready for today's tests?" The engineer glanced at the chamber. Panels flickered with schematics of defensive drones, floating energy shields, and delicate control interfaces. "Tests?" he asked cautiously. "I thought we were done testing my ability to survive breakfast pastries." She laughed, a soft, musical sound that bounced off the crystalline walls. "No, today you will demonstrate whether an engineer can influence diplomacy, strategy, and, if necessary, heroism." He groaned dramatically, drawing a faint chuckle even from the hovering holographic aids. "I signed up for engines, not intrigue," he said. "Although, come to think of it, engines do influence something." She tilted her head, one ear flicking in amusement. "Do not underestimate the importance of applied knowledge in a galactic court, nor your unique perspective." Her gaze softened just enough to make him feel simultaneously grounded and exposed. "You may find that humor is sometimes as important as skill." Their first task of the day came in the form of a diplomatic demonstration gone awry. A delegation from a volatile neighboring system had arrived, their ships in orbit humming with subtle tension, carrying emissaries with a flair for dramatics. They had intended a demonstration of interstellar engineering prowess, but had instead triggered a malfunction in the palace's energy barriers. A small arc of plasma sizzled near a balcony, sending floating trays spinning, and one overeager emissary nearly collided with a hovering fruit sphere. The engineer swallowed his panic. "All right," he muttered to himself, rolling up his sleeves. "Time to be essential." With a mixture of careful calculation, improvisation, and humor, he set to work. He approached the misfiring barrier, tracing the conduits with hands that shook only slightly. Holographic readouts flickered warnings, and he muttered obscure equations under his breath. A misaligned drone zipped past, carrying a floating tray of ceremonial refreshments, and he caught it with a deft swipe, muttering, "Not today, flying cake. Not today." The queen watched from above, her expression a mixture of amusement and approval. When he corrected the energy barrier's alignment, she leaned slightly forward, eyes glittering. "Impressive," she said softly. You may not yet command armies or fleets, but you can command ingenuity. By midday, the palace was alive with laughter and astonishment. The emissaries, initially tense and suspicious, had been charmed by his awkward competence and self-deprecating humor. One diplomat even tripped over a hovering rail and, rather than erupting in anger, found himself laughing alongside the engineer, who offered a hand to pull him upright. Though the hand was not required, the gravity field had its own idea. The Queen's amusement was palpable. She leaned against the balcony, long golden hair cascading over her shoulder, a smile tugging at her lips. She had, perhaps, never seen someone so human survive so many absurdities with both dignity and charm. The afternoon brought more personal challenges. The engineer was asked to assist in a delicate negotiation with a minor faction within the court, a group of advisors who were fond of subtle sabotage and clever wordplay. Their goal seemed to be to unsettle him, to expose weakness. Instead, he relied on a combination of technical knowledge, careful observation, and humor. When one advisor attempted a rhetorical trap involving quantum entanglement metaphors, he responded with a deliberately absurd but technically sound analogy comparing it to a misbehaving breakfast pastry. Laughter rippled through the room, breaking tension, and even the most skeptical advisors found themselves reluctantly charmed. The Queen's smile widened. She had orchestrated a situation that might have defeated any ordinary participant, but he had survived with ingenuity and laughter. Evening approached, and the palace settled into a softer rhythm. The engineer, exhausted but exhilarated, found himself on a balcony overlooking the city's orbital structures. Ships glimmered like swarms of fireflies, and distant stars blinked as if sharing in his amusement. The Queen joined him, stepping lightly, her green skin glowing faintly in the ambient lights, her long golden hair brushing against her shoulders. She did not speak immediately, allowing him a moment to simply breathe in the vastness of the galaxy. You have grown, she said finally, voice soft but firm. Not merely in skill, but in perspective. You have embraced the chaos without being consumed by it, and you have found humor where others find panic. That is a rare quality, even among our kind. He smiled, though modestly, unsure how to translate centuries of human self-doubt into words worthy of a queen. I tried. I guess I'm learning. He glanced at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Though I think the palace itself is trying to kill me in small ways. Her laughter was like music. Perhaps it is, she said, but survival is the test of adaptation, and adaptation is the essence of life. She stepped closer, the glow of her green skin catching the shifting light, and extended a hand. He took it, feeling the unexpected warmth of connection despite her alien form. You are no longer merely my guest, she said, eyes steady. You are a partner in the fullest sense of the word, and perhaps, in time, something more. He realized, with a start, that he no longer felt like the timid engineer who had stumbled into her court weeks ago. He was confident in his knowledge, comfortable in his humor, and capable of acting decisively when circumstances demanded it. The awkwardness remained, a little, but it was tempered by competence and courage, by the understanding that being human in a galaxy of wonders was not a limitation but a strength. Night fell, and the palace glowed softly in a spectrum of blues, purples, and golds. The engineer and the Queen walked together through corridors that now seemed familiar, their steps guided by both instinct and gentle humor. He tripped once, narrowly avoiding a floating console, and she raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching in amusement. Still learning, she said. Yes, he admitted, bowing slightly, but faster than I expected. They paused on another balcony, looking out at the city, the stars, and the vast night fell, and the palace glowed softly in a spectrum of blues, purples, and golds. The engineer and the Queen walked together through corridors that now seemed familiar, their steps guided by both instinct and gentle humor. He tripped once, narrowly avoiding a floating console, and she raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching in amusement. Still learning, she said. Yes, he admitted, bowing slightly, but faster than I expected. They paused on another balcony, looking out at the city, the stars, and the vast expanse of space beyond. He realized that the life he had once thought ordinary had transformed into something extraordinary, filled with challenges, humor, discovery, and connection. And he understood, for the first time, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. The queen turned toward him, her golden hair falling softly over her shoulder, her green skin glowing faintly in the starlight. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges," she said, voice low and certain, "but together we will face them." He smiled, finally at peace with the absurdity, the danger, and the wonder of his life. "Together," he echoed, the word feeling heavier with meaning than he could have imagined. The palace seemed to hum approvingly, lights shifting gently, corridors settling, and the faintly floating orbs winking as if in shared understanding. The engineer felt himself changed, no longer simply a visitor or a timid repairman, but a part of something larger, something alive, something utterly extraordinary. He had stumbled, laughed, learned, and endured. He had bridged worlds, found humor in chaos, and discovered that even in the vastness of the galaxy, connection, courage, and a touch of absurdity could carry him farther than any starship ever could. And as he stood there, hand in hand with the queen, looking out at a universe full of possibilities, he knew that this was not the end of his story. It was, instead, the beginning of a life intertwined with the extraordinary, a life in which he was no longer just an engineer, but essential, capable, and perhaps most importantly,